Good evening. I'm Derek Fildebrandt. Welcome to another special edition of Danielle Smith Uncensored. I think that's what we're gonna call this for now. We're gonna continue with what we started last week, a series of interviews by Danielle Smith, guest hosting on the Western Standard, dealing with controversial issues around COVID-19 that you might not hear in the CRTC government-regulated media. Wink, wink. So to begin with, I want to thank all of our members who have signed up. You're doing important work supporting bailout-free media. If you're not yet a member, go to westernstandardonline.com/membership and sign up to get complete and unlimited access to the Western Standard. We encourage you to post your questions and your comments. Remember, if your comments are too long and fill up half the screen, we can't share them. If you swear or use bad language, we can't share them. But if you have short, cogent thoughts, we'll be happy to bring your comments across the screen. Also, comment with each other. But we'll bring your comments across the screen after the presentation from Dr. John, who is with us today. Danielle has assured me that Dr. John is a real doctor. We did not make him up and just call him Dr. John. Dr. John is his real name, but I understand we're not using the last name because he's got enough patients and he doesn't need all of you to bug him. So without further ado, I will hand the show over to Danielle Smith to cue us up for the rest of the episode. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much, Derek. Thanks for giving me this opportunity to co-host and guest host on your show. I should just give a word to our sponsor. We do have a sponsor. Today's podcast is sponsored by Chiron's Way Consulting, certified and affordable natural solutions for anxiety and stress relief. You can book online sessions, or if you live in the Calgary area, in-person sessions are also available. Just go to www.chironsway.com to find out more. That's Kyrons way. Well, that's nice that we've got a sponsor for this. And I'm delighted that Dr. John has joined me for what we're calling One Final Hurrah. When I was in radio, I came across Dr. John shortly after the new dietary guidelines had come out. And he got in touch with me. And because I'm an Atkins diet enthusiast, and he is an enthusiast of a book called Eat Rich, Live Long, we developed a relationship and friendship over talking about dietary issues, how you keep yourself healthy, how you keep your immune system strong, and then bang, COVID hit. And if you're wondering why I've been able to keep my sanity for the last year, it's because every time a new study or a new development or a new potential therapeutic treatment came on board, I was able to ask Dr. John if there was any good medical research behind it. And he was able to steer me down a path of what looked promising and steer me away from things that didn't look promising. So I thought that this would be a good opportunity for us to have a chance to talk about all of the things that we weren't able to fully talk about on the air. I don't know why it is the case, but it seems to be the case that any discussion of therapeutic remedies is immediately discredited or downplayed. And what surprises me about this is if you want to go online and look at a pandemic planning exercise called Event 201, it was put on by the Johns Hopkins Institute. It was literally a month before we discovered COVID in America. And what we found was what one of the sessions found was that what in the pandemic planning exercise, the things that we should be focusing on is finding cheap, available, readily understood, easily assimilated therapeutics so that you could delay the onset of the worst outcomes when a new virus hits. But for some reason, I got thrown completely out the window when the real pandemic hit. So do understand that talking about therapeutics shouldn't be controversial. It was never seen to be controversial before. It is controversial now. I don't know all the reasons behind that, but we will go into the medical research and just prepare yourself. There's a lot of slides here. We've got a lot of information to get through, and the state of medical research is a pretty sorry one. And with that, we will go into discussing with Dr. John. He's got a series of slides that we'll go through. And let me put it to you that way, because I think that was the first conversation that we had is, why is it that we don't have very good medical research on a whole range of issues? And that's a big answer to get started with, but I think will help frame our discussion. Dr. John, go ahead.
Thank you, Danielle. It's a great pleasure to be with you here. And We miss you already, but hopefully we can still keep in touch with you with a few things now and then. But anyway, I was going to start. I started with some quotes from a couple of people from, well, I think it would be arguably that the two most prestigious medical journals in the world are the New England Journal of Medicine and the Lancet. So this is a quote I've highlighted down the bottom. Marcia Engel wrote, "It's simply no longer possible to believe much of the clinical research that is published or to rely on judgment of trusted physicians or authoritative medical guidelines. I take no pleasure in this conclusion, which I have reached slowly and reluctantly over 2 decades as editor of the New England Journal of Medicine." Quite stunning that someone in that position would write that. And then this one is from Richard Horton, who is the editor of The Lancet. "The case against science is straightforward. Much of the scientific literature, perhaps half, may simply be untrue, afflicted by studies with small sample size, tiny effects, invalid explorative analysis, and flagrant conflicts of interest, together with an obsession for pursuing fashionable trends, dubious importance, and science has taken a turn towards darkness." And yeah, there's things that have happened in the last years. One of the biggest things is funding. Much of the funding will come from pharmaceutical companies, much of it will come from government, but these researchers are always fighting for funding. Sometimes half their job is trying to find funding. And to get funding, you need to publish, and to publish, you need positive results, or to get more chance of getting funding, you need positive results, and they just tend to publish positive results. We'll get into a little bit about the pharmaceutical companies in a bit, but they do much of the funding as well. And so we've ended up with a state where, these two people in these positions, editors of the most prestigious journals in the world, have said, we can't trust science anymore.
Which is a pretty remarkable statement.
It very much is, yes. So I put this on the screen because it kind of was a landmark milestone in my journey in this area. And this book came out, I think it was 2012, written by Nina Teicholz. She's a scientific journalist, and she wrote this book called The Big Fat Surprise. And in that book, she details and dissects every important study in nutrition going back 150 years. And as she's going through that, you see how bad things are, how bad the science is, how bad the conclusions the scientists reach, the conflicts of interest, the pushing agendas and ideas. And just when you think it can't get worse, you turn the page and it's even worse. And it was quite revealing and kind of led me to be more vigilant in looking at things and really come to the point where if I want to understand an issue, I have to go to the basic research. I have to read the studies. I have to dissect these studies. I have to understand them myself. And here's an example of bad science. So, well, this is good science, but I'll translate it to bad science. So we have associations. So in this case, we see two associations. One is forest fires and ice cream sales. And the second one is shark attacks and ice cream sales. And you can see that they correlate beautifully. But I'm sure no one would say eating ice cream causes shark attacks. Of course, the confounder is summer. And it's easy to see on this graph. But when you look at another graph where it's red meat and cancer, and you see a nice correlation between the more people eat red meat, the more cancer we see. It's harder to see. It's harder to understand. But it's still the same problem. It's still what we'll call ice cream science. And so we have levels of evidence, and this is a basic diagram of the lowest levels of evidence up to the best. So of course, expert opinion at the bottom. Case series, that's like when you have one patient and you report the findings and you publish it, and they can be important to start science. Case-controlled studies. And this would include epidemiological studies where you're studying populations, cohort studies. So that's when you get two groups of people and you follow them along and you look for differences in them, and you usually start prospectively, which means you're going forward. randomized controlled trials. So this is the gold standard trial. So this is where you take two groups of people, you try to match them as good as you can, and one group gets an intervention and one group gets a placebo. Ideally, it's blinded, so the researchers and the patients don't know who's getting the real thing and who not. And then after a year or two, you unblind it and you see what effect happened. And then the top would be the systemic reviews. And this is where a scientist or a researcher will try to put the science all together. They'll take many studies and basically put them into one study. And this, if done properly, is the best evidence. The problem is at any level here, a researcher who's savvy with bias can influence and make the results not conform to perhaps what they should have.
So before we leave this, Dr. John, when we're talking about the scientific research that we'll be talking about tonight, how much of it has gone up to that randomized control trials versus some of the other levels? Like, I think part of the reason we saw some early promise about hydroxychloroquine, zinc, and azithromycin is because of Dr. Didier Raoul, who did that early type of research with his own patients. But do we have a lot of evidence now at that top level on the random controlled trials on the different therapeutics we'll be talking about tonight?
On some of them we do, but there's controversy about that, and we'll kind of try to plow into that and figure that out. And not all epidemiological studies are bad, and they can be helpful, and we're going to talk about that as well. And so for example, I haven't seen a randomized controlled trial on whether penicillin works on meningococcal meningitis. But with meningococcal meningitis, it's pretty much 100% fatal without treatment, and pretty much everyone lives with treatment. And it would be unethical and crazy to do a trial, a randomized controlled trial on that, would it not? So if you get enough effect from an intervention, you can take that as valid even if it's not a controlled trial. Smoking and lung cancer. I haven't seen a randomized controlled trial of whether smoking causes lung cancer, but we've done these associational studies where people who smoke have lung cancer rates 10 or 15 times more than people who don't. And when we see a large association like that we take as serious, important, and true. Generally, there's all sorts of ways that this is done, and it's standardized. For example, Bradford Hill or the grade criteria. If you see an associational study with an effect that's at least double, then you start taking it seriously. But anything less than that, you can just ignore.
Okay.
Okay, Richard Feynman, he's one of my favorite scientists of all time. He's a physicist from the last century. Worked on the nuclear bomb, and quite well known if you grew up in the 60s and 70s like I did. And he wrote a lot of things, a lot of really interesting quotes, but this is one of my favorite. If it disagrees with experiment, it's wrong. And that simple statement is the key to science. It doesn't matter any difference how beautiful your guess is. It doesn't matter how smart you are, who made the guess, what his name is. If it disagrees with experiment, it's wrong. That's all there is to it. And my writing on the bottom there's the point here is empirical data trumps theories, it trumps models, it trumps guesses. So we really want to look at the data. And if we have a beautiful theory, but one black swan comes out and refutes our beautiful theory is toast. Consensus is not science. Science is not consensus. This is the life expectancy of populations in the world, and you can see the top is Hong Kong, and Canada's near the bottom there. But interesting, Hong Kong's not a country, but the reason I put Hong Kong as the longest lived population will be clear in the next slide. So we look at meat consumption around the world, and Hong Kong by far are the biggest meat eaters, 60% more than the nearest country. And yeah, but they live the longest. Isn't meat bad for you? Right? And so this, again, is an associational study, and it doesn't tell me that eating meat makes me live longer. It doesn't tell me that you can't be healthy on a plant-based diet. You certainly can. but it does blow holes in that premise that eating meat is bad for you.
Well, and thank you for going to that point as well, that we've got to look at real world data. So much of the COVID response has been centered around computer modeling. And so it's nice to be grounded in what we're actually seeing. Now, I think the next sort of series of questions we're going to get into helps us to understand what COVID-19 is and what SARS-CoV-2 is. The way I've heard it described to me is SARS-CoV-2 is the virus that causes the disease COVID-19. And there was some really good early work that I played on the air with Dr. Kyle Cameron-Siddell, who was struggling with this question of, is COVID-19 a blood disease that causes a respiratory condition, or is it a respiratory disease that causes low oxygen in the blood? Because one of the things that he observed is that people were coming into his emergency room with what looked like altitude sickness. And when they tested the blood, they had dramatically low levels of oxygen, almost lower than you could expect, that you could still survive. And our traditional way of treating that is to treat it by pushing more oxygen into the lungs. But if it's a blood disease causing your lung problem, then you'd have a whole series of different solutions. So I wanted to sort of frame that. That was my thinking coming into it. And I wonder if you can explain to us what is COVID-19? Is it a lung disease, or is it a blood disease, or is it both?
Radio. So this slide, it's a little bit complex. I'll just take a second to go through it. The top, you see the people, the green, they're healthy, feeling good. The orange, they're not feeling very good, but they're feeling like they've got a cold. The red people are feeling really quite ill, and they're in hospital. And the black people, they're in ICU on ventilators, or even possibly passed away. Then you see the next line down is oxygen saturation, viral replication, inflammation response, and then the bottom is time in days. So day 1 is when you get infected with the virus, and day 5 is when you start feeling symptoms. Day 12 is when you get into the early pulmonary phase, the early stage where you're really starting to get sick and thinking, I might need to go to hospital. According to day 15 is when you're quite ill, if you are somebody susceptible to COVID. And I think what's important here is that the viral replication stage, although it starts 5 days before you get sick, by the time you're on to day 12, which is 7 days after the onset of symptoms, the viral replication phase is pretty much done. And now we switch to a phase of the illness where it's more of an inflammation, that cytokine storm we've talked about, and it's the effects of the infection that are now ravaging our body. And if we're going to give treatments for COVID, and if we come to a place where you start SARS-CoV-2 and COVID almost interchangeably, I think we kind of know what that means, but COVID is the illness. But if we are looking at treating COVID and we give a medication that's thought to work by preventing viral replication, clearly it's going to work if we give it sooner in the illness than later in the illness. And if we wait till day 12 when people are being admitted to hospital, it's practically useless. Now, when they did, we're going to talk about hydroxychloroquine for just a minute here. So we had some decent studies before we had COVID arrive on our shores, some in vitro that showed that it was effective against, for example, SARS-CoV-1. And we had other ideas. We had mechanisms of actions that might work, and a few studies that weren't really very good. But we're in a pandemic situation. It's a pretty safe drug. People started using it. And so we had the Didier Raoul in France treating it. And he did an early pilot study which showed there's less viral replication, and kind of gradually worked through the point by almost trial and error as well, that if you gave it with zinc and a macrolide antibiotic, it seemed to work good. And we have multiple studies, case studies, and studies of physicians treating sometimes thousands of patients with the medication and getting good results to the point they felt it was unethical to do a randomized control trial, just as the penicillin and meningococcus would be. But we didn't have that gold standard. We didn't have those RCTs that the academics and the health authorities really like. So that was put together. The decision was made to do something on the. Whoops, sorry, Dad. How do I get rid of that?
Technical difficulties. Please stand by. This always happens.
I'm
Normally,
just
this
going
is
to
when I
chime
would
in
go
here
to a
and say
commercial break.
that we could pay taxes to Justin forever.
There we go. So,
you know, Doc,
then,
I just want to underscore what you're saying here too, because this, I think, frames why there has been so much controversy around it and so many studies that would cause people to dismiss any of the good evidence. Because one of the things you and I kept writing back and forth about was that when they did give hydroxychloroquine, it was often in that late pulmonary phase. Yeah, so it was at the exact opposite. It was almost like the last ditch effort to try to save them.
right.
But that's not when you would give hydroxychloroquine. The second thing is that you kept on saying they're doing the studies wrong. First of all, they're not giving it early enough, but they're also not giving it with zinc and azithromycin, and having all three of those seems to be the ticket. And so I think that that's important to understand why it is they would structure the studies that way. Based on, do you have some observations about why they would have done it that way?
Well, yeah. So, I mean, if you talk to your average infectious disease doctor, they will say, "Oh, we've proven hydroxychloroquine doesn't work," and they'll look at the recovery trial, which was they did, to their credit, decide we need a big multi-center study, randomized control, to check all these treatments to see what works and what doesn't. And hydroxychloroquine was one of them. This was the recovery trial. And they had, what else? Steroids like prednisone, or sorry, methylprednisone IV. They had remdesivir. They had a few other things. But the point is, I looked at that trial and I said, well, it can't possibly work because sorry, that got things all coming on. It can't possibly work because it's given too late, and they're giving it to people who are sick and hospitalized long after the viral replication phase is an issue. But even more so, I looked at that study and I had to look at it several times, saying, what are they doing with the hydroxychloroquine? People who use hydroxychloroquine know it has a narrow therapeutic window, which basically means if you so it has you have a toxic dose and you have a dose that works for the treatment, and that window can be wide or narrow. For penicillin, it's huge. There's a huge variance with penicillin, but with hydroxychloroquine, it's very narrow. And I looked at the dose and I said, that's really high. I had to go look it up, and sure enough, not only it was toxic, it bordered on fatal. And why they were doing that is beyond me. And in fact, in that study, they of course showed not only hydroxychloroquine didn't work, it had a 10% higher mortality rate.
So then let me ask you if you have seen any studies that are structured properly. So what you've told us is that it should be given within the first 5 days of diagnosis. It should be given in conjunction with zinc and azithromycin. It probably should only be given to those who are at risk as well. I'll let you comment on that. But how many studies have there been that have been structured properly and given it at an appropriate dose as opposed to a fatal dose? Do we have any random controlled studies on that, or have all of the studies been structured incorrectly?
To this date, we're missing that gold standard RCT that combines zinc, a macrolide antibiotic, and was started as early in the course as possible, and had enough people given to ill people. It's not a lot of sense in studying people at low risk. To this date, we're missing that, but there are over 100 studies showing hydroxychloroquine works. And so if you examine the literature, and I haven't read all 100, but I've read about 30, there is a definite trend which says if you give it early with zinc and azithromycin, it seems to work. It's a trend, but to this day, can I say for sure hydroxychloroquine works? I suspect it probably does, but I couldn't say for sure.
Okay, let's go on to the next slide, because I think that this is important, because as we were talking through the last year, you were keeping me up to speed on what the research was showing on hydroxychloroquine, zinc, azithromycin, that 3-drug mixture. But then you got quite excited about ivermectin many, many months ago. And so I was waiting for that to cross over into the mainstream so that we could talk about it. But you saw some early signs that this was going to potentially be effective. Tell us why. What was it you were seeing?
So I saw a study done by a physician done in Florida in June of last year, so quite some time ago. And it was people admitted to hospital. It was retrospective, and that means you've got the data, and now you're looking back, and it's not going to be as high quality, but it definitely something to listen to, and but it was randomized and controlled, and it did show clear benefit in people treated with hydroxychloroquine compared to, to ivermectin compared to people who were not, and it was controlled, and it was very, very interesting. I thought at that point that this would be picked up by the NIH, by many other researchers, other countries, and we would see funding of multiple studies, proper studies that would get going over those months, and we would start to see the data building up very quickly of good, high-quality studies. Little did I know. So then over time, we're starting to get more data out, but it's coming from countries like Bangladesh and Egypt and Argentina. And so where are the studies done in North America? Where's the studies done in Europe? Well, it's completely being ignored.
Derek, can I just ask you to remove the banner for a minute so that we can see all of the potential treatments that are there at the bottom? So just, Doc, quickly run through what this graph is showing us.
Yeah. So it goes back to what we talked about, the viral replication phase versus the inflammatory phase. So in the viral replication phase, you're going to give medications that prevent viral replication. I didn't mention remdesivir was in the recovery trial that we talked about last slide, and it showed remdesivir didn't work. But it was given again. Remdesivir is an antiviral, and of course it didn't work. Anyone would know that. Yet remdesivir is the only drug approved by the FDA for use in the treatment of COVID, based on one study by the drug company back in April that showed a slight reduction in hospital stay, no effect on mortality. And also the Solidarity trial, which is the big UN trial, came out a week before the FDA made that announcement, which again said remdesivir doesn't work. I brought that up because if we listen, or if I get online and look at the docs chatting back and forth in the States where they get remdesivir and they have lots of COVID, they'll all say it does work if given in the viral replication phase. In fact, Trump got that. So it's not on this list, but it could work there. So anyway, yeah, ivermectin is there. Flavonoid is like quercetin, zinc, vitamin C, vitamin D. And then in the next side, that's where you have to treat the inflammation and the cytokine storm. You have to treat the blood clots, and that's what all those ones are about. But it turns out from the data that ivermectin has anti-inflammatory effect too. So it works in both.
Wow. Doc, let me just make sure that I'm summarizing and understanding this, because you and I've talked so much about it. I want to make sure that people are following us along here. From everything you've told me, there really are two phases of this disease. So the first phase, and you can see it quite clearly on this graph, this first phase is this period where you want to use antivirals to keep it from replicating. And then there's sort of this later phase where you need to have anti-inflammatories. And you've talked about a cytokine storm. If I understand that, and anyone who has a family member has rheumatoid arthritis or an immune disease, it's your own body attacking you at that point. Is that right? Is that sort of what happens in the second phase, and why you need to treat it differently if you haven't managed to stop it in the with antivirals?
That is the case. Your immune system is just going crazy trying to fight off this supposed infection, which is now gone, but there's viral debris left, and your body is caught up in the crossfire.
Now, tell us why there's blood clotting, and as well, tell us why you have hypoxia. That's that sort of that low oxygen in the blood. What is happening there? Where is that in the phase of this disease?
Well, this COVID virus is quite nasty, and it starts as a lung disease, but it infects many cells in our body, and there's several theories as to why this is the case and several possible mechanisms. For example, there's ACE2 receptors on the lining of our blood vessels as well, and if the virus can attack the blood vessel lining and strip the cells off, the exposed basement membrane underneath will release clotting factors. The virus also releases a protein that causes platelets to aggregate and stick together, be more sticky. If you have something called leaky gut, and I know you've talked about that on your show, And lipopolysaccharides, LPS, which are kind of waste products of bacteria get released into your system, they have the virus causes them to cluster and bind together as well, which then can cause this blood clotting. And it's what we call macrothrombosis. Microthrombosis. Macrothrombosis, that's when you get a blood clot in the vein in your leg that goes to your lung. Microthrombosis is where the little vessels get plugged up. And so if you see a CAT scan in someone who has bad COVID-19, that is in fact blood clots and the microscopic blood vessels in your lungs.
Do you know, I think one of the things that we're all struggling with is understanding who's at risk and who's not, because for the vast majority of people who get COVID, we're seeing mild symptoms or no symptoms. For the vast number of people under the age of 60 who get it, they recover. And so it is a nasty disease if you've got the worst manifestation of it. But what is it that makes the difference? Why do some people get it and it's mild, or they don't even know they have it? And then other people find themselves very quickly deteriorating, hospitalized, ICU, and dying.
Yeah, and a healthy 80-year-old has the same risk as someone who's 30 years younger. So the biggest risk factors are fatty liver, hypertension, obesity, diabetes, cardiac disease. I think I said obesity. Anyway, those are all manifestations of hyperinsulinemia or metabolic syndrome. And of course, we're going to get to that in a minute. The other thing, of course, very strong risk factor is vitamin D levels. So low vitamin D increases your risk of severe COVID by a factor of 10. And we know older people don't manufacture vitamin D as easily as younger people. But it also turns out vitamin D is a marker for metabolic syndrome as well. So I think that the second pandemic here is this metabolic disease, and we actually have two pandemics. One is COVID-19. The other is this ongoing pandemic of hyperinsulinemia, metabolic disease, diabetes, prediabetes, whatever you want to call it. That is where the problem lies.
Okay, and we will talk about how you strengthen your immune system and address some of those things. But just to explain to me some of the frustration that I have expressed and how you feel about it too, so based on what we've talked about here, if you get diagnosed and you're high risk based on some of the factors you've talked about, the number one most important thing would be for the doctors to get you on some kind of antiviral so that it doesn't replicate. And yet, I don't know if this has changed, but it seems like the advice from Alberta Health Services to doctors is send your patient home, tell them to drink fluids, get plenty of rest, take Tylenol, and hope they don't have to go to hospital. It doesn't seem like it's a very robust treatment protocol, considering how devastating the outcome can be. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, it's very frustrating. Like, they won't even say to take vitamin D. I just don't get it. The advice, and I'll be more harsh, their advice is, hope you don't get sick enough to die and then go to hospital. So yeah, it is frustrating. I don't understand why they won't even acknowledge some of these things. Well, with ivermectin, there are some issues there, and we're going to talk about that in a bit. And I kind of understand that they're in a rock and a hard place there. But for goodness sake, vitamin D, improve your diet. These are not hard or controversial things. You can make meaningful differences in your insulin level within 2 weeks of changing your diet.
Wow. Okay, so let's go on to the next slide then, because I think you're giving some a bit of a potential for treatment and a bit of a guidance. And as you're talking about this, maybe just give people some guidance about how they should use this information, because I would never see that people should just self-medicate. And I don't know why people would think that they would run out and if they could find the medication, do it. I don't think that's ever been the case, but that's part of the reason in some cases, I think, why we haven't had an honest discussion about this is because you can get various drugs online. You can get them through, veterinary practices have some of them, but I just want to be clear, like, when you're taking medication, you should take it on doctor's orders and a doctor's prescription. So just give some guidance to how people should be using the information that you're going to go through now.
A lot of the frontline docs are aware of this and are prescribing. They are doing what's called off-label prescriptions, which is quite normal to do. I do off-label prescriptions daily. I think I read 1 in 3 chemotherapy treatments is off-label. So it's not unusual at all for a doctor to give a blood pressure pill for a headache or birth control for acne. This is normal. What's abnormal is for the first time, we are being told not to use a drug. Whether it's off-label or not, an approved drug, a drug with safety, we're being told not to use it. That's unusual. Anyway, in this slide, most of the prescriptions, or most of the top drugs are prescription regardless. And so in the anti-inflammatory phase, we talked about steroids, radiation. Colchicine's a neat one. It looks like it could be important to use. These are all going to be done in hospitals. These are the hospital docs who are probably going to give those, although colchicine could be prescribed as an outpatient before you got that sick. The XOCD-124, that's that Israeli cancer drug. It's packaged into lysosomes, which are like basically little soap bubbles. And the CD24 is known to be a very potent inhibitor of your immune system. And this is given in the late phase where you're really, really sick, and it's having amazing results, but it's only in phase 1 trials. So it looks very promising, but it still has some work to go. Antivirals, we've talked about a lot of them. I don't think we could take the time to go through all of them. And then the bottom is things that I have in my cupboard. You can get them all over the counter. And I did start a COVID treatment protocol way back in March and pretty much morphed into something like this. And it's funny how my plan agrees very carefully with, or very closely with, the published treatment plans we're going to see in a minute.
So just run through those, just so people know, because I'm familiar with vitamin D, zinc, quercetin. I don't know if I'm saying that right.
Quercetin, that comes from broccoli.
From broccoli. Oh, there you are. Vitamin C, melatonin. I'm taking that because I can't sleep at night. You and I have talked about that. Liposomal
glutathione.
Okay.
Or N-acetylcysteine, which is a precursor to glutathione. It's a powerful antioxidant. The problem with glutathione is it doesn't absorb unless you take it from liposomal sources.
Okay. And then continue with the rest of that list.
Yeah. So
magnesium.
250 to 500. Selenium. Selenium is if you have low selenium foods. Now here in Alberta, we have low selenium soil west of Highway 2, but the farmers all know that. So all the animals are supplemented with it anyway. So I've been testing selenium. I haven't seen low selenium in anybody. So that's supposedly it makes the list, but I'm not sure how important it is here in Alberta. B6 is interesting. It looks like it might be really important in helping your immune system work properly. And famotidine or Pepsid, it's an over-the-counter anti-acid. Looks like it could be helpful. I get people to take that when they get sick, not prophylactically. Aspirin, we talked about how blood clotting happens in this disease, and aspirin is a very good idea for someone with risk factors right from the get-go, provided it's safe for them to take it.
Okay, I know people are going to be frustrated by this conversation because you've run through a lot of different potential things that you can take to improve your immune system, and yet we never seem to talk about that at all.
This is the short list. There's many more.
Okay, so let's go to this eye mask protocol, because when Ivermectin finally made it into the mainstream, hit the big time, it was when Dr. Pierre Corey and his group finally gave a presentation to the Senate, and he was just pleading because he's a frontline doctor. He deals with very severe COVID patients on a daily and weekly basis, and he just wanted to get it widely known that ivermectin could be helpful. So tell us what this protocol is all about in this IMAS group.
Sure. Yeah, this East Virginia Medical School group, they had amazing success in treating COVID in their intensive care unit right back in the spring. Back when, if you went to ICU with COVID, 80% of people just didn't come out. They were having 10% of people pass away. 90% of people were coming out of their ICU. They were the first to use prednisone before anybody else did. They said, this is an inflammatory disease. We have to use it. There is an intravenous vitamin C. They were doing several things that later were kind of carried on by the mainstream. So they were on this right from the get-go. Dr. Merrick is the leader of the group. He is the second most published author in intensive care, in critical care. He literally no one writes a book by themselves these days, but he literally wrote the book with help on critical care. Every critical care doctor knows who he is. This group, there's 6 of them. They've published 200 papers. So these are not lightweight people. They know what they're doing. They've treated thousands of COVID patients in their intensive care, thousands. And they were having success, and they thought, we have to bring our treatment outside of the ICU. They got onto ivermectin back in September. They started looking at the data, and it started to grow, and they started to say, you know, this looks really good. And they finally got to the point where say, there's enough there. It's a very safe drug. We got to start using it. And as they use it and started having even more success, we've got to share this with everybody. And that's kind of how they got to that point. So this IMAS protocol they put out, I don't know, sometime in the fall. Like it was November for sure, maybe October. And there was another one that came out in August. I've got that the next slide just to
do that. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is a published paper, published, peer-reviewed, August. It's in the literature, Dr. Peter McCulley. And again, it's all very similar. You'll see right in the middle there, ivermectin is right there in his algorithm.
Here, can we see that slide? I think you just had the 2 of us on it. I think the docs moved on to the next slide. Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, ivermectin right there. And we don't need to spend a lot of time on it, but the point is there is published treatments out there. It's not like there's nothing to do. And most of them are extremely safe. Vitamin D, extremely safe. We're going to talk about that a bit more too. So ivermectin, it's been around for decades. It's absolutely perfectly safe. The only side effects we ever see is because it is an anti-parasite drug, and you give it to people with parasites, the die-off of the parasites makes them sick. Billions of doses have been prescribed worldwide, billions. And we just don't see problems with it.
Well, and that's, I think, important because Merck disavowed ivermectin very shortly after this came about. And so go through a little bit. I know you've got a number of slides here on ivermectin. Why don't we just zip through them? Because part of this shows that we've got random controlled studies on these, and the fact that there is credible research on it. And so I just wanted people to be able to see that there's been a lot. I was
going to go to the Merck. Right.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll just get back. I was at the Merck statement, but okay. So here's a meta-analysis. This is top-tier data. This is that researcher taking the studies and putting them all into one big, gigantic study. And this one was done by Dr. Laurie. She is a PhD researcher in England, and this is what she does for a living, is she does meta-analysis. And she got wind of Dr. Corey's testimony to Congress, which anybody can watch. It's quite compelling. Or if you want to see the press conference, just go to YouTube and search FLCCC, and you'll see their press conference. But anyway, so she said, I'm going to look at these studies, and I'm going to do a meta-analysis. And she did. And this is a busy slide. Don't pay attention to much of it. I just want you to see on the very right-hand side, this line coming down, 3/4 of the way down with a 1 at the bottom. Anything to the left of this line is clinically significant. Anything to the right is not. And the black dots are where the study falls, with the error bars going to the sides. And I want you to notice the 3 studies where the line crosses to the non-significant side, but they show clear tendency to positive effect, but because of it could be they didn't have enough participants. There's a lot of reasons why you have a wide margin of error. But to say that there's no effect, I think you have to say, well, maybe there was. Okay, so, and let's leave that one. So Dr. Laurie, the papers that she wrote, it's quite long. I can't recall. It was like 50 or 60 pages. But this is one thing I picked out. Ivermectin prophylaxis among healthcare workers in COVID-19 contexts probably reduces risk of infection by 88%.
Now let's make sure that we're clear on what it means to be take it as a prophylaxis, because that is also really significant for our healthcare workers. Because one of the things we keep on getting told is that we have a limited number of healthcare workers that can treat COVID patients, and it's part of the reason we've got to keep the pressure off the hospital system. But if you can have a drug that they can take and it would prevent them from developing the symptoms, that's kind of, that would be significant. Is that what a prophylaxis is, or tell us? Yeah. Prophylaxis would be a medicine you take before you got sick to prevent you from getting sick, or if you do get sick, prevent you from being terribly ill. And so this, by saying that 88% reduce the risk of infection, when you look at that number, what do you say?
I think that's quite stunning. If you could, if this is a nasty disease, if you can reduce it by 88%, holy smokes, you're cooking with gas there. That's really good. And again, down you could look at the bars and the error bars, and all those are to the left, which means they're all clinically significant. The problem is the quality of these studies is not as good. A lot of them won't be blinded. They won't be randomized. But again, we're going to get to that in a minute too. But it's quite stunning. And of course, we study healthcare workers because they're so easy to study. Mm-hmm. Okay. And this is the conclusion of her paper. Ivermectin is an essential drug to reduce mortality and morbidity in COVID-19. And the second statement, very important, placebo-controlled trials of ivermectin treatment among people with COVID-19 infection are no longer ethical.
Wow, so that goes back to the point that you were making. You can't do a random random controlled study blind on smoking or on the use of penicillin in the treatment of certain drugs, because it would be unethical to allow people to get the disease and die without the treatment.
Yeah. Okay, now here's another meta-analysis. This was done by a group of doctors here in Alberta, and I think was at the direction of the government. I'm not actually sure of that. And they came to a different conclusion, reviewing pretty much the same studies. So here's their key findings, and I want you most, it's too busy to go through it all, but key point number 3, with respect to ivermectin's ability to treat people with COVID-19, 7 studies that had a control group reported the effect of ivermectin on death, or reported an effect on ivermectin death report for COVID-19. 4 studies showed deaths from COVID-19 were down, while 3 studies showed deaths from COVID-19 were not affected. Look at those words, not affected.
What's the implication for you?
Well, here it is. There's the 3 studies. This study right here missed clinical significance by 2 1,000ths of a point. So clinical significance is a p-value of 0.05. Now, if you take that and invert it, you get 20, which what it means is that if you do that study 20 times, it will be positive 19 out of 20 times. You'll get 1 false positive. That's what clinical significant means. So in effect, what this is saying is that this arbitrary rule of 0.05, and this was 0.052, that this one would be something like, if you did the study 29 times, 18.9 times it would be positive. So when I read this back in here, and they just simply blatantly say we're not affected, I go, did you guys just want it to fail? You know? Anyway, they're technically correct. They're following the science. They're strict science people, and this is what they do.
But Doc, that doesn't make sense to a regular person, right? That you would have 2 different teams look at the same information, and one comes to the conclusion that it would be unethical not to give this treatment because the evidence is so strong. And then for this other group to essentially come to the opposite conclusion, that's confusing to the public.
It's confusing to me. But so that's why, now remember, I've over time read the vast majority of these studies. So I've been through them all, and I see them and look at their biases. And I think what compelling things are this. Every study shows effect. Maybe a few don't show clinical significance, but everyone shows effect. They all seem to work. Some quite stunningly so. And again, I'm going to show you some of those in a moment here. And hydroxychloroquine, it didn't. It had effect, we thought, in many studies, but it wasn't nearly as strong of a signal as ivermectin. And Dr. Laurie, she did say moderate confidence. So she didn't say high confidence, she said moderate, which means I'm pretty sure it's good, but I'm not that sure. The studies, those gold standard studies haven't been done. So in fairness, she did say that, but then she made the same conclusion I did, is that, we're not treating acne here. We're treating a serious disease that's caused widespread problems and mega issues, right? That this is one of the worst things. Just the response to the virus is one of the worst things going. And if we had any kind of hope of treating it that looked like it worked pretty good, that was super safe, that seemed to have no side effects at all, and with the evidence I'm just about to show you, you? Well, I think what I'd like to do is ask the researchers who did this, if your mother, your spouse, or even you were sitting in hospital on day 7 of illness, short of breath, on oxygen, and a doc came by with a bottle of ivermectin, what would you do, having read all these studies?
Because that way you might get a different answer. So just so I'm clear, what makes ivermectin so unique is it can be used as a prophylaxis. So in that one study you showed us, 88% of the healthcare workers who took it did not develop the infection. It can be used in the early stages as an antiviral so that you don't end up with the replication. And
Yeah.
it can be even used in the later stages as an anti-inflammatory so that you don't end up deteriorating onto the worst condition. So it can be used at all 3 phases.
All 3 phases, obviously, the sooner you use it, the better it works.
Okay. So what are you showing us here?
So this is a study done in Egypt. And what they did is they had people who had COVID-19, and they gave ivermectin to all the household contacts. It's just that simple. And then they did that for several months, and this is the data. Now, your classic academic research will say, well, this study had lots of potential confounders. It wasn't blinded, and but then look at the effect.
To explain this for people who aren't used to what, because you're saying this is really dramatic. What stands out for you?
So of the households where the people were given ivermectin, only 7.4% of the household contacts to the positive patient came down with COVID-19. Of the households who did not get the ivermectin, over half of the contacts in that house had COVID-19. That's to me, that's quite dramatic.
Okay.
Mexico. So these are states in Mexico, and it turned out that one state, for various reasons, decided that they were going to mass supply ivermectin. And so what happened is we go from no ivermectin to, I can't remember exactly when, it was August 1st, sorry, it was August 1st. And you can see that the deaths, this is mortality, the deaths dropped by 80-90%. Peru. So a busy graph, but let me explain. It's quite easy. Just look at the red lines, which is mortality, and then look at the shaded area before the red line peaks, and the shaded area and the white area after the red line peaks. That line where it turns from shade to white is the day that mass ivermectin was started to be given to that population in that state. And in Lima, Peru, they didn't get it, and they had a totally different curve. That it was totally different, no connection. Clearly, this is good evidence that, okay, there's something there. All right, so this is an interesting study of healthcare workers. And again, it goes back to my idea that you don't necessarily have to have randomized controlled studies before you pay attention. So this is done on 1,200 healthcare workers in Argentina. 400 of them were not given the ivermectin. 800 were given ivermectin also with the carrageenan, which we had in one slide. But anyway, they're given ivermectin and carrageenan. First thing the research will say, well, that's 2 confounders. That's no good. You know, they won't like that. But anyway, that's what they're given.
Meaning you can't tell which one is the one that's having the therapeutic effect. I got it.
However, 2 months later, 3 months later, they look at the results, and of the 800 healthcare workers who were given ivermectin, zero, came down with COVID. Of the 400 who were not given ivermectin, 258, well over half, came down with COVID.
Wow. Now, tell me what kind of a study is that? Because that's not a random controlled study, but what kind of study is that?
That would be called a prospective cohort study.
And is there, just tell us the drawbacks of that. Why would that not be persuasive to decision makers?
So it's not blinded. The people who get the ivermectin know they're getting it. The people who don't get the ivermectin know they're not getting it. It's possible that the people who didn't take the ivermectin didn't want it and refused to take it for specific reasons. Maybe they thought they were healthier and didn't need it, or that maybe they were adverse to taking medications. You know, there's all sorts of possible confounders. But if we had got results where, 200 of the ivermectin got COVID and 210 didn't, or well, put out the percentage. But if you know what I mean, if we got much closer results, okay. But when you get 0 and over half, I'm going to pay attention to that.
No kidding. Go on to the next one, because then I want to get to why Merck disavowed their drug.
Sure. So this is just to show that a week after the Alberta review study came out, the NIH came out and said, well, we're going to be neutral on ivermectin. So they're not going to either disavow, they're not going to recommend or not recommend against ivermectin. They're saying we're neutral, so use at your discretion, basically, is what they're saying to the docs.
Tell us the significance of that, Doc, because as you mentioned before, you used to be able to use any range of drugs off-label if you felt it was going to be effective. But this crisis was different. You essentially got an edict not to use certain drugs. So I guess neutrality is better than being told, no, you can't do it. But what do you think is happening here with this statement?
Well, that'll lead perfectly into the next slide.
Perfect.
So this is the Merck statement on ivermectin, where they've come out and basically say no scientific basis for potential therapeutics for use against COVID-19, no meaningful evidence for clinical activity or clinical efficacy for getting those 50 studies, a concerning lack of safety data in the majority of studies, considering it's their drug and they've given it free to billions of people in Africa to treat river blindness. And they're saying they're questioning about safety. You know, there's something funny about this, right?
There is something funny about it, and I want to just sort of delve into that a little bit more, because I remember when this came out, when they first indicated they were dropping their vaccine, and we'll get into vaccines in a minute. They said a couple of things. They said, we're going to focus on therapeutics. And also, our vaccine doesn't have the same success rate as some of the others. So that's why we're shifting gears to focus on therapeutics. And so I thought, great, now we're going to see that they're going to mass produce ivermectin. And then bang, this statement came out, and it seemed to be totally at odds. If they're offering a drug, and as you say, 3 billion people have used it to treat parasites. We should also say one more thing about ivermectin. It's received a Nobel Prize, right?
Yes. No. Yes, it did for treating river blindness. Yes.
So that seems to enforce the idea that it is a safe drug if 3 billion people have used it. So explain what's going on.
Well, it's only pennies a pill, and it's not non-patentable. So
It can't be that. No. Like, please tell me that's not the case. That because it's so cheap and because it's generic and because anyone can make it, please tell me that you wouldn't have pharmaceutical companies disavowing it for that reason.
I'll tell you the story, and then you can decide for yourself. So
please.
So Merck acquired a company for $420 million dedicated to COVID treatment. So yeah, as you heard, they're going into that. They got $350 million from the government to research COVID. They've produced a promising therapy. It's called CD24FC. Interim results say 50% reduction in mortality. So that looks okay. That's great, right? So how could they dismiss 50 plus studies that supposedly show no evidence? So Merck made Vioxx. I don't know if you recall Vioxx. It was about 20 years ago. It was an anti-inflammatory drug that came out, but the big deal about it is it didn't cause stomach ulcers. But after it had been out for several years, it was withdrawn because it became clear it was causing people, mostly men, to die of heart attacks. And in fact, it's estimated somewhere between 150,000, even up to 500,000 men, or people, women too, were killed by this drug from heart attacks. So Merck was sued, and in the examination of discovery, it turns out they knew about this. They saw it in their data, and it turns out their bean counters, I should say, decided that they were still going to make more money from the payments they're going to have to make the lawsuits than they went ahead with it, and they didn't tell anybody. So it's one thing to put out a drug that causes a problem, but it's the other thing to put out a drug you know causes a problem and not tell anybody. That's called a felony.
So tie this back then to ivermectin.
Right. So this criminal behavior in the pharmaceutical company goes on. The drug companies like Pfizer, Glaxo, Sanofi, Merck, they paid out $30 billion in fines and settlements, in various compensations. They're convicted of falsifying data, defrauding regulators, defrauding insurance, all criminal. No one goes to jail though; they just pay a fine.
Wow.
So they seem to control the whole process. If you're in the scientific research, most of the studies are be decided by drug companies. So they decide what study's been done, what's going to be published, this one's not very promising, we're going to drop it before it gets anywhere, who the researchers are. They fund the journals. So most of the journals depend on their lifeline is advertising from these drug companies.
So let me just draw two connections then, if I could. So one thing that I'm a bit perplexed by is that all of these new vaccines, I mean, it seems like we're holding therapeutic remedies to a standard up here, and we're not holding these brand new mRNA vaccines to the same standard. That's confusing to me. But also on the issue of liability, there's blanket liability that is offered to these companies on vaccines so that if there's an adverse effect, that they don't get sued into oblivion. So why wouldn't there be some similar indemnification for a therapeutic drug so that you could treat those people who got ill prior to the vaccine being available? Like, there seems to be two different approaches with these, and I can't square the two of them. Can you?
Well, first of all, for a therapeutic drug being prescribed off-label, it's on the doctor doing the prescribing, and I have insurance.
Okay.
So if I prescribe ivermectin, Merck is not liable in any way at all for a treatment that's off-label. So that's the bottom line to that question.
So then why would they bother issuing a statement about safety? It had the read of people are now interested in this, they're prescribing it, we better get the lawyers to draft up some language so that we can be covered from legal liability. Or is it the other side? Is it a 50-cent pill doesn't generate as much money as a $30 vaccine or a $420 specialized therapeutic treatment, which is, I think, what the going price is for remdesivir? Like, is that what it comes down to?
It seems so. So the thought leaders are paid by the drug companies. They're the ones, when I go to medical conference, they're the ones standing up there telling me what to do. They're the ones educating me on the latest treatments and such. In the news media, you'll know this, in the news media, the television news media down in the States, was it 60% of CNN's funding comes from pharmaceutical companies? I think I read that. So political campaigns, Obama, I think, spent $1 billion to get elected. How much of that came from pharmaceutical companies? They are by far the biggest contributors to political campaigns, pay twice as much as anybody else. They have tons of lobbyists. Google, they have a big deal with Google. They're buying data from Google for an exorbitant amount of money. But we're to the point now, if you say anything that is contrary to the interests of a drug company, or even perceived as so, it will get transported on Google down to the third page. So it will get a warning. This has misinformation in it. So Doc, let me tell you how I'm looking at this. The way I look at it is that COVID or SARS-CoV-2 seems to be manifesting itself similar to influenza. And we know that influenza does not have a perfect vaccination rate, and there's some vaccine hesitancy, and you don't end up with a perfect population with 100% vaccination. But we also have Tamiflu. So it strikes me that therapeutics and vaccines are two streams of income for a company. And it doesn't make sense. Like, sure, by all means, pursue your vaccine, but also that people are going to get sick. So make sure therapeutics are available. And if there's a cheap one that you can use right now, great. If there's something that you can patent that has a better outcome, great. Like, it doesn't strike me that there would be any reason why these streams of research can't be going on at the same time. So I feel like I'm still missing something. Well, what would a pennies per dose pill that's 90% effective do to my vaccine?
Would probably create some vaccine hesitancy. People would say, why do I need it? Or
especially if we were using it long before there's vaccines. Let's say it really worked as good as we think, and we're giving it to all the people in nursing homes, and we get through this pandemic the same way we do every other way, which is develop natural herd immunity. Yeah, it might create vaccine hesitancy, but it certainly would reduce the want or need for a vaccine. Absolutely it would.
Okay, let's continue on, because I'm going to get you to comment on politics. I think your next slide has something to do with Alberta.
I'll just
because can I tell you, Doc, this is the thing I find really frustrating is I have you as a resource, and you've been giving me this information all the way throughout the year. And we've put as much on the air as we possibly could, but within the limitations that we've just talked about. There's a lot of nervousness about talking about these therapies. But why do no politicians seem to get this information? What is like, we have to sort of try to understand what the gatekeeping role is of the medical profession in preventing politicians from understanding that some of these remedies are available. And you can either comment on that now or we can comment on it later. But that's the thing that I found very frustrating, is that it seems like there's one medical view, it's the official view, no one's allowed to challenge it, and there isn't the full broad range of discussion going on. So that makes me very nervous about your profession, that there's that kind of gatekeeping of information.
It seems like that's the world, and it seems like my profession's been captured by the pharmaceutical company, and to a large degree, I believe that's true. And the WHO gets 50% of its funding from Big Pharma, CDC, NIH, the American Heart Association, right? So why is pharmaceutical companies even allowed to give any money to the FDA? Or, why? Because they're supposed to regulate them. It just makes no sense.
Good point. All right. Let's go on to our next slide.
Okay, so this is the...
Oh, you know what I wanted to ask you on this one, because I had you on the show. It's sort of funny because someone reminded me of this when the cases were subsiding, and they've dropped off dramatically. I keep every week, I keep posting, here's the hysterical predictions that the health minister said, that we would have 10,000 cases per day in Alberta and 3,500 in hospital within 6 weeks. Well, we're partway through week 5. And as you've seen, the hospitalizations are at somewhere between 250 to 270, of which I think about 50 are in ICU. And the daily case count is anywhere between 300 and 500, very, very low, nowhere near what the computer model projections were. But you were on the show, and you talked about sort of viral seasons, how they peak at a certain time and then they subside. And someone reminded me, said, you had that doctor on who said that it was probably going to subside by mid-February. So tell us what you saw that all of the advisors around the premier didn't see.
Right. And our best wishes to those people in hospital and ICU for sure.
Yes.
Yeah, so this is the graph of daily cases, and as you can see, it clearly, anyone who looks at this say, yeah, December 4th, it cleared. I even got it marked there, December 4th. Anyone who looks at this can see that. So how did I know these things? So back in the spring, I didn't really know much about pandemics or epidemics, so I thought I'd better read. So I found this book by Edgar Hope Simpson, The Transmission of Epidemic Influenza. And he was a fellow, I think he actually was alive during the 1918 flu. And he wrote this book in the 90s. He was kind of in his, I think it was in his 80s when he wrote the book. And what was amazing to me was how complicated these pandemics, viral pandemics are, and how little we really understand about them. How they're seasonal, and in the Northern Hemisphere, they seem to peak, in the winter or early spring. In the subtropical states like Southern United States, it seems to peak in the summer, like July and August, and then it moves down to South America and hits them in their winter. And they would all of a sudden just flare up. It's almost like the virus was sleeping in the population and something triggered it, and all of a sudden we had all these cases. You couldn't possibly explain it by the virus being introduced to an area and then gradually growing. It's like it just sprung out of nowhere. We don't know why that happens, but we know it does. And so when we see these pandemic curves, they're classic, and they're generally, you're going to get an up, generally lasting 6 to 8 weeks. It peaks and it goes down. It's pretty much without fail. You could get a longer one if you're in a really heavily densely populated area. Like say you're in London, it's like each borough has to get it, so it could stretch it out. But reliably, you're going to get a 6 to 8 week up and then starting on the way down.
One of the things I wanted to ask you too is, since it moves around, is there some place we should be looking to as an early warning of what we're in for? I mean, can I look at what's happening in British Columbia, and do they peak earlier than us? Is South Dakota the measure that we should look at? Should we look at what's happening in Europe? Is there anywhere that you looked and said, aha, this is likely what we're going to experience in Alberta? Is it maybe it's not that? Where? Tell me.
Well, I looked around at places that seem to be ahead of us. There's no way to predict who will be ahead of you, but I looked around at places that were ahead of us. So I looked. Well, first of all, before that, this is the blue line is mortality in Florida. The red line is California, and you see Governor DeSantis up there. And it was on September 26th. He got a second opinion. So he got Michael Levitt, Nobel laureate. He got Jay Bhattacharya, Harvard epidemiology PhD, medical doctor, and other. And they pitched the case very similar to what we're talking about in a few minutes here. And he liked the governor, liked what he saw. So the next day, he basically ended the lockdown restrictions. They didn't go to do nothing. I think it's really important. You hear that letter rip, and that's the other side arguing. To me, they don't have a good argument for your question, so they have to denigrate you somehow. But that letter rip comment is simply not fair. And you can see that there's not the slightest quiver in that mortality curve. Nothing. It didn't make any difference at all. Now, they are comparing with California, and I think that's unfair. You want to be really careful about comparing specific countries, specific states, and provinces, because there's lots of reasons why one place will have more mortality than another place. I think on a wider area you can, but on individual things, you've got to be very careful about comparing.
Well, I accept that, but I think one of the things that those who want to propose lockdowns will do is they'll look at data and they'll say, aha, lockdowns work. They're the only answer. Doing anything otherwise is irresponsible. And I don't know all the reasons why viruses rise and fall. I mean, I have probably a list of 10 or 15 things I can imagine. But is there anything that you look to say definitively one way or the other, yes, we should lock down, or no, we shouldn't? I mean, this graph seems to suggest that, because California was a big lockdown state. Right.
Well, you can see here, I put this on here just to say that you cannot perceive any difference from the lockdown or without the lockdown. There's no perceivable difference, or with mask or without mask. So studies have been done. There's several now. There's at least 30 studies. It's not hard to find them. And they took real world data. So they're taking the data from the last year. They're looking at countries that locked down early, late, hard, soft, didn't lock down at all, and they looked for an association to mortality, just like this graph. And there's no significant association to lockdowns and mortality. And what it appears is that the heavy lifting is done just by the basic hand washing, stay home if you're sick, social distancing. Those kind of measures seem to be what's doing the trick, and the lockdowns seem to add very little, if anything. And that's what the real world data shows. And we'll get into that in a bit. But what I did is I just looked at states right on the northern border. So right below us, I looked at all these states here. And it was kind of interesting because you could see Illinois is locked. They peaked November 13th. Michigan, November 20th. Minnesota, November 14th. Montana, November 14th. North Dakota, November 14th. So you look at all these graphs, and then you understand where my head is. Get to it a bit more yet, but where my head is that fully locking down just doesn't do any better than the measures we had in November. I was really happy with Premier Kenney when he was at the end of November saying, personal responsibility, that's what works. People are going to do their part. They know what to do. We just have to keep the course. And so disappointed. We came out a week later, like it was about December 7th, I think. And he said, we have to lock down, or there's going to be 4,000 people in hospital, right? And so he said, we're going to lock down on December 13th. A lockdown can't have any effect, really any perceivable effect, for at least 2 weeks. So now we're in between Christmas and New Year's. And if you see those two dips, that's Christmas and New Year. So in between there, before the lockdown could have had any effect at all. I don't know. I look at that graph. Can you see any effect that the lockdown had on cases?
No, and if he'd been looking at the graphs you showed us about all of those northern states, they were a couple of weeks ahead. He could have reasonably foreseen that that we were really close to peaking.
Right. So I have this idea that they peak in 6 to 8 weeks. I see these northern states have already peaked, and of course 3 weeks later, we're at December 7th. I can look at those, and now we're 3 weeks. It's easy to see. It's easy to see 3 weeks later. So that would be right there. Gee, for sure it's peaked and come down. So is it a stretch for me to have emailed you on, early December saying we've peaked and that the lockdown is a waste of time? And it's quite distressing to me that the people advising Premier Kenney, because it's not his fault, it's the people advising him. The people advising him, I think, just got to him, but they were not just wrong; they were wrong in the opposite direction, right? Maybe he needs to get a second opinion as well.
Oh, I've said that to him, definitely. And I should mention, because that's what Ron DeSantis did when he when he shifted, he actually held, and I think you sent me the link to it, a full 1 hour education session with those 3 doctors who are signatories to the Great Barrington Declaration. And he got them publicly to walk him through the data, which allowed him to bring the public along with him. And I always felt like Jason the Premier should do the same thing. But Doc, the variants are going to get us now. Didn't you hear that they could just all of a sudden slingshot out of control? You don't look at the data. It's not the empirical data we need to look at, because something could happen. And whether it's Dr. Theresa Tam saying it's going to slingshot up to 20,000 cases per day within 6 weeks, or whether it was our own health minister saying 10,000 cases per day within 6 weeks, they have the same talking points. They've got the same computer modelers. Why doesn't this make sense?
And the same thing happened in Ontario as well. It's because they're models, and models only work as good as the data you put in, and models are always wrong. It's really just a matter of how far out they are. Real world data, empirical data always trumps models. It's models. They've been the consistent thing about the models is how consistently wrong they've been, right from day one. That first empirical college model that sent England to their lockdown because they were going to do more of a personal responsibility thing, and yet the models came out and said there's going to be 10 or 20 times more deaths than it actually turned out to be. So these models have been wrong. You can't rely on them. We shouldn't rely on them.
So Doc, there must be something that the Premier is persuaded by. I mean, I think he follows the United Kingdom very closely. And so he must be persuaded that something went completely out of control in the UK or South Africa. What's the other side of that argument? Just give me your best stab at trying to understand why these variants may be the threat that the government is telling us.
Well, of course, Premier Kenney's in an impossible situation. There's no decision he can make that people aren't going to die. It's very difficult, and I really quite feel for him. But for this graph you see here to be plausible, you have to have a completely new virus, or you have to completely have these variants to completely be able to evade prior immunity obtained by prior COVID infections. So my premise here is that we're approaching herd immunity. And again, I go back to that book by Edgar Hope Simpson. You get a first wave, you get a second wave, and occasionally in the next season, you'll get a mild third wave. But by the time you're done the second wave, you're approaching herd immunity. And I just picked this out. It was an opinion piece, backed by some science by a physician, Markey. But he said, the consistent and rapid decline in daily cases since January 8th, now he's talking about the United States, of course, we started in December, can be explained only by natural immunity. And I totally agree with that. The only thing that explains this is natural immunity. And because it's the second wave, we know we're approaching herd immunity, which is the only way pandemics end. Whether that herd immunity is obtained by vaccine or by naturally acquired immunity, that's the only way pandemics end.
Let me delve into this a bit, because you introduced me to this concept early on as well, and it seems to be a factor, and it must be a factor in these mRNA vaccines, is that there's two types of ways that our body develops immunity. One is by the development of antibodies. We've been talking for months about, there's not a strong enough reaction in the body to develop antibodies, and that's why you aren't protected if you do end up getting COVID or SARS-CoV-2. But there is also this other aspect of T-cell immunity that people are talking about. And the way I understand that is that your body has two defense systems. So if you've been introduced to a virus that is similar to SARS-CoV-2, maybe SARS-CoV-1, maybe another coronavirus, you actually have some memory in your T cells that know how to fight that. That's how I sort of think about it. Can you just sort of link these two things together? Because otherwise we're going to be terrorized by variants until the cows come home, because anytime a new variant comes about, we're going to think, oh my gosh, this is novel, it's brand new, and it can race through the population. Here's another computer model to show exactly why we're scared. Tell me what T cell immunity is, and whether you think that this is a factor here.
Well, absolutely. So yeah, T cells and antibodies are two of many potent weapons your immune system has against foreign invaders. So T cells, it's a live cell, and it's got sensors on its cell wall, and it's looking for a signal that something's not right. It seems to know how to tell the difference between what belongs in your body and what doesn't. And if it finds something that doesn't belong, it attacks it. It has chemicals it puts out that basically like acidify and eat whatever it's sticking to. It can engulf it, and it will send out signals and attract other forms of immunity to that cell that's infected. Now, the cells, they have a mechanism is when their mechanism has been taken over by a virus. So a virus comes in and messes up the machinery and uses the cell's machinery to make more viruses. The cell's nucleus senses this, and it actually puts out proteins that actually transport these foreign proteins to the surface of the cell, so the T cells will recognize that that cell's infected and come to destroy it. It's quite an amazing system. And they also put out mechanisms that stop the cell's metabolism or slow it down so that they can't make as many viruses.
I'm going to pose something to you, and I want to see if you think I'm on the right track here. I think that they made a fundamental error in the computer models when they kept calling this a novel coronavirus. I think that they felt like it was like it came from Mars, and none of us had ever seen anything like it. And 100% of us were going to get infected with it. There was going to be a 3.4% death rate. We had no immunity to respond to it. And as we've discovered, maybe these mechanisms in the body from other coronavirus exposures, maybe that did give some protection. And so the models were built on the wrong premise.
Yeah, and of course the antibodies we know for COVID, if you get COVID infection, you develop antibodies, they're gone in 3 months. So interestingly, they did recover some actual viral particles from the Spanish flu in 1918. They dug it up from a grave in Alaska. It was kept in the permafrost. I guess the year that this woman was buried, it was a warmer year, but then it was permafrost, so her lung tissue was salvaged. They got the virus. So about 20 years ago, 15 years ago, they found a survivor of the 1918 flu. They checked her blood, and she still had T cell immunity to that virus.
Holy cow, that's amazing. Okay,
it's amazing.
It really is. So then, can we transition into understanding how mRNA vaccines work? Because my sense of it, and correct me if I'm wrong, but my sense of it is it does activate this kind of T cell immune response. So talk to me about it.
That's the big advantage of the RNA vaccines, is they get the cell's machinery to make part of the virus. That part of the virus gets expressed onto the cell, and your T cells immunity comes and gets sensitized to it, and then you develop these T cells which are now sensitized to that spike protein. And I've got a slide on it a little bit later on how that works, but that's exactly the case. And that's why these vaccines are a little different, and I hold more promise to them than regular vaccines as far as developing immunity. Granted, they are new. They have been tested very quickly at warp speed, so there are some concerns there. But I think if you are at risk and you're in your 70s, you definitely should get it. As a healthcare worker, I think I have a higher responsibility to do that. So for now, I think whoever can get the vaccine, it's probably a good idea to get it. We'll worry about whether people who don't want the vaccine or not can get it later.
I guess this is the missed opportunity that I see, is if they had been all along telling us about these two different types or multiple different types of ways that our body fights off viruses, then I think we would have already been prepared for this new vaccine stimulates a response in a different way, and there'd be less vaccine hesitancy. I think they've kind of failed in the education campaign.
I think you're right. And now, of course, T cells, what they basically do is they take some antigen and put it in a little well, and they march T cells past it and see if they're attracted to it. That's in effect how they test T cell immunity. And we know at least 50% of the population has T cell immunity to SARS-CoV-2. At least 50%. We've got lots of papers on that.
That's kind of a shocking study.
It is, and I've got other things. So they always talk about, oh, look at New Zealand, how good they did, right? But let's take all those countries in Oceania. You take a map, you draw a circle, you start at the tip of Japan, top, you go round India, all the way around Australia, New Zealand, and back up to Japan. Every one of those countries, regardless of policy, Japan didn't lock down, right? So regardless of policy, every one of those countries, their mortality rate was 20 or 30 times less than ours. How do you explain that? We don't know, but my guess would be is that a virus, a coronavirus, went through that area recently. That's one plausible explanation. In Japan, a really neat study, they got a group of 400 people, and they checked their blood every 2 weeks in Tokyo, and they checked for antibodies. And as they did it, they saw the antibody levels rise at the same time as the PCR tests were rising. And 50% of those 400 people that they tested had positive COVID and SARS-CoV-2 antibodies. And then it waned off, and that's fine. But the difference was, so they got it. Like Japan got the virus, it's clear, but they didn't get sick.
Interesting. So I have a theory, and again, I would love for someone to test this. But I have a theory that SARS-CoV-1, that original SARS outbreak from 2003, I wonder if there was a lot of asymptomatic or mild transmission of that virus in the same way. And all we focused on was the extreme cases, because we had a terrible outbreak in Toronto. And I'm wondering if it really just had more spread in that Oceania countries that you're talking about, New Zealand, Australia, all of the Asian countries, China, Japan, and others. I wonder if that's is anyone researching that to see if there's a correlation?
I think there's people thinking about it. If there's active research going, I don't know, but there's definitely people thinking about these things. Why is Central Africa virtually untouched? Virtually no cases. Who knows? I don't know. South Africa got it. Why is Central Africa untouched? We don't know.
Wow. That's going to be such an interesting area for future research. But let's be clear, it had nothing to do with lockdowns, right?
Right. That's the thing. And so when everybody holds New Zealand out, oh, look at, they locked down, they got no cases. And look at Sweden, they didn't lock down, they got hammered. But if you compare Sweden with fair metrics, and it turns out that the most important metric of how bad you got COVID was how bad your flu season was the year before. It's very consistent. Europe's got such good data, very consistently. If that country had a very mild flu season the year before, they got hammered by COVID. If they had a very heavy flu season the year before, they didn't. And when you compare Sweden on that metric, they did just the same as everybody else. No worse, no better. They made mistakes. They know they made mistakes, but their economy's not destroyed.
Oh, I can't wait to see some of this research and correlation come out afterwards. Let's go through some of your other slides here, because we've sort of been talking. Yeah. I don't want to dismiss. I know some people are very concerned about the new vaccine, and I know that there is hesitancy out there. So I don't want to just gloss over that there are certain side effects in certain people who shouldn't take the vaccine, and they've even set up a fund for vaccine injury so that you can get compensated from it. What I've seen the most is that it seems like there's an anaphylaxis reaction that people are having. If you're going to have a reaction, it's an allergic reaction. But then there's also this new AstraZeneca vaccine, which they suggest is not going to be very effective among those over the age 65. I mean, my mom sent me a note saying, it's only 60% effective. What's the point? And so maybe you can address a couple of those things as well.
I actually, if I were going to get a vaccine and you put the three in front of me, it's the AstraZeneca I'd get, just because it's more familiar technology. It's not brand new. It's been around a lot longer, and the mechanism of action I'm much more sure of. And so if I had to pick one of the three, I'd pick that one. The data is the data, but who knows, right? And maybe they need a booster. It's still, even so, 60% is better than zero, and we're short of vaccines. Bring it on. I think that's fine. If you are over 65, if you have risk factors, this virus is around. It's nasty. Your risk of the vaccine is way less than the risk of the virus. You go ahead and get the vaccine,
regardless of which one, any of the three.
Yes, whatever they can give you. If you're a 22-year-old woman and you're trying to get pregnant and you're metabolically well, and your risk of dying from COVID is less than your risk of being in an accident driving down to get the vaccine, to me, it's a no-brainer. The vaccine has not been rigorously tested like other vaccines. She should not get it. And for the rest of us, we have to be somewhere in between. And the argument, well, we have to get it to get herd immunity, but we don't even know if these viruses prevent us from spreading the virus. That's still an unknown. For all we know, we could still get asymptomatic infections and still be spreaders, even if we get the vaccine. So these are all unknowns. I think, to be realistic, it is a crisis. Get the vaccine if you think you need it. I've had many people get it. I've had no problems. I've only had 1 or 2 people I've suggested not get it, as did their specialists agree, and they had quite serious autoimmune disorders, and they're just worried about
all the more reason why
reactions.
there needs to be this parallel track. So vaccines, yes, but there will always be a percentage of the population who is high risk that you need a therapeutic for because they can't take the vaccine. So I think that reinforces that we should have always had a dual track approach. Continue on with your slides there, Doc.
Okay, so this about variants. So here's the British variant, but there's several other variants. And the concern about the variants is that they seem to be more strongly binding to that ACE2 receptor and thus more virulent, possibly. We don't know that, but they certainly seem to be more infectious. The controversy is, are they 70% more infectious or just 10%? And really, it only has to be a little bit more infectious to take over from the other viruses, to become the dominant virus. So, and there's a wide margin of error, but the point is they might be more infectious, they might be more virulent. When I look around the world, I look at the data, I look at where these viruses are being introduced, I still just see the regular expected pandemic curve. I don't see any major thing.
You don't see the slingshot anywhere.
I don't see the slingshot. We should be concerned about variants. We should watch them. But there's nothing out there I see right now to make us lock down again. The most important thing, the single most important thing about variants is, do they evade the immunity required from a prior COVID-19 infection? If the answer is no, we're safe, we're approaching herd immunity, Dr. Tam's slingshot has not the slightest chance of being reality.
And as we've discussed, if T-cell immunity is one of the mechanisms that's enacted, then it should be good against a variant. That would be one thing.
Absolutely should be. But here's the rub. So you got the new variant, and it should not, see the headline, should not create a problem with the vaccine. You keep hearing, oh, the vaccine will work on the variants. No problem, no problem, no problem. But then at the same time, you got Theresa Tam's slide, we're going to have a pandemic because of the variants. Well, the problem with that is that if you believe in the vaccine, then you have to believe in acquired immunity. Acquired immunity is always better than a vaccine, except for one very specific case. Acquired immunity from the actual infection is always stronger and longer lasting than the vaccine. So how can you say on one hand, don't worry, the vaccines are we're safe, and on the other hand saying we're going to have a pandemic from the variant, we have to lock down?
Doc, you can't. That's why my brain's exploding right now, is that we're asked to believe two things that are in conflict with each other. Okay, thank you for making all that clear. I'm not the crazy one. That's good to know. So the other thing I want you to just address, because you've read that book on pandemics, is there was an epidemiologist that was quoted in mainstream media, Colin Furness, I believe is his name, said that one of the things that we know about viruses is they want to survive and they want to replicate. So even if it is the case that they become more transmissible, it doesn't necessarily mean that they become more deadly. Is that always the case?
It's not always the case, but the norm is they become less virulent and more infectious, because then they're going to replicate more. So normally, as a virus ages, it becomes less serious, but not always.
Okay. And when would we know? Wouldn't by now, with the variant that they're of concern in the UK and the variant of concern in South Africa, wouldn't we now know whether it was more deadly as well?
It's not that easy to tell. These are fuzzy numbers, so that we just don't know the answer.
Okay, one more thing. We were up at 1,800 cases per day, came down dramatically, just as you described, is the normal pathway for viruses. Why is the Premier still so concerned now that he's seen a slight tick up some days or a slight tick up in hospital some days? Why is that? Like, I would think that if we were going to see the kind of slingshot that Theresa Tam and Tyler Shandro revealed a few weeks ago, you'd need something more than that to make you that panicked. And so what am I missing? What are they seeing that I'm not?
we would have seen it by now. This virus, these variants have been around long enough. We'd see a signal somewhere in the world. We'd see it, and plus we're coming into spring, and we know the virus is going to get weaker. I see no reason to increase restriction measures. I see reason to open up. I see, at the very least, we should open up to the same restrictions we had in November. That they clearly worked.
Okay.
You saw it in the curve, right?
Okay, one last thing I want to raise with you, though, because when this virus got introduced and we started counting it, I don't know if it was introduced here earlier. I've had all kinds of doctors and nurses tell me that they saw some weird x-rays and they didn't diagnose with influenza, and they wonder if it actually was here prior to February, March, when we started counting it. But we did have, that's what I think freaked the premier out, is that I think they thought that that was the worst of it, is what we saw last March or April, when we were really just catching the tail end of it. The worst of it was what we saw in November, December. But it does make me wonder, is there a chance that we're going to get a slight bump similar to last year that we saw in March, April?
Yeah, there could be a third wave, especially if the variants are a bit more virulent. I just think it's unlikely. As we're coming into spring, we're got herd immunity. This is just not the way the viruses act. So I think it's unlikely, but it's nothing's possible.
Okay.
I need to ask Derek to stop the screen share for just a moment. I've frozen. I'm just going to have to reset.
Okay. Does that mean that you're going to go offline for a bit?
No, I'll stay online, but I'll just stop the screen share.
Well, then let's talk. Can you dual task? Are you able to talk to me while you're doing that? Because I think we're now about to transition into the discussion about really where we started, which was, I think we may have lost the doc. So we're going to transition now. We did this segment a bit differently than the one with David Redmond, because I just knew that there was going to be a lot of material to cover, and I wanted to show you that the doc has been educating me all the way along the way. So in a lot of cases with these presentations, and we'll do a few of them, the presenter will just want to do straight through, but we didn't leave as much time for questions. But this is really the bread and butter, I think, this next section that we're going to get into, which is the question that all of you kept asking me: why does no one talk about how to improve your immune system function? Why does nobody talk about how we can increase immunity? And that really is the forte of the doc. That's kind of where we began in talking through all of this. So I'm not sure how you're feeling about what you've seen today. I hope it has filled in a few blanks for you. I hope it has also shown you that we're getting some mixed messages. And I hope that, as I've always just counseled you to do, just read as broadly as you possibly can and come to your own conclusion on issues. Now, Derek, I don't know if you're with me there, because I haven't had time to look at any of the questions coming in, but are there some comments that you want to raise while we're waiting for the doc to come back on?
Yeah, I think one of the commonly raised questions is still about vaccines. I know you and Dr. John addressed it. I think it's one of the areas where we've lacked a very informative public discussion on it. I'm broadly pro-vaccine. I'm not anywhere near the front of the line, nor should I be, but when the time comes, I have an intention to take it. But I'm probably in the middle on that. There are some people who believe that vaccines are just bad for you, shouldn't take them. Some people are more extreme and believe that there's nefarious purposes behind them. And then there's the other side that believes if you don't just do what you're told and take it, you're a bad person. The government should pin you down and stick it in your arm. So that's quite a spectrum. I'm not used to being in the middle of many things, but I'm on this one.
Oh my, you're the centrist, Derek. My goodness.
Don't ever call me that again.
Yeah. And I think the doc, if I can summarize, if I can just summarize what I thought I heard the doc say on that issue, and I'm glad he's back so he can hear that too, is that if you are of a certain age and have risk factors, you should take it unless your doctor tells you not to. There will only be a certain number of people for whom it's more dangerous. If they have also don't have clear information, if you're pregnant, wanting to become pregnant, or lactating, if you're young and healthy and have no other conditions, then it's probably not the top priority for you to take.
Right.
And then everybody else in the middle is would have to sort of make their own judgment based on their own comfort level. But what I heard the doc say is that if you're over 65, and especially if you've got pre-existing conditions, your risk associated with getting COVID and having a bad reaction is worse than the potential risk of getting vaccinated from any of the 3 vaccines. Doc, did I summarize what you said there correctly?
Yep, that sounds good.
Okay, so I'm prepared to move on to talking about what I described as essentially your expertise, which is how do you keep your immune system strong? Unless there's any more slides that you want to cover on COVID in particular that we missed, but I'm quite happy to talk about all of the ways in which you can essentially heal yourself through diet, which is one of the things that we talked about a lot over the years.
Sure. Okay, the screen share is on. Can you see the slide?
Have we got that? It's coming up. Here we go. Go ahead. Yep, we got it.
Okay. All right. So interesting study 2 years ago now that they looked at Americans. They looked for metabolic markers. So look at things like blood pressure, triglycerides, HDL cholesterol, waistline, etc. And they found out that 88% of American adults are metabolically unwell and only 12% are metabolically well. And how do you know? Well, some obvious things. If you're 40 years old, look around at the 40-year-old people in your office and tell me how many people don't have the pot belly. They've all got metabolic syndrome, and we probably aren't as bad as the United States, but I would think at least 2/3 of adults in this country, certainly anyone over 40, has metabolic syndrome, and most of them don't even know it.
That's, I guess, interesting because that ties in with what the medical practitioners are telling us about why those with pre-existing conditions is such a big problem with COVID, is because there are so many people who are metabolically unhealthy. That being said, not everybody who has one of these conditions and in their 40s or 50s is going to have necessarily an adverse outcome, right? I mean, you can still recover.
Yeah, I mean, the further along you are in that road, and they say 3 or more conditions is really the main thing. But if you look at, and this is the short list, there's many more things that metabolic syndrome can express as, but if you look at these, how many of these are major risk factors for COVID? A lot of them, right? And if you look at what the big risk factors for COVID, at the heart of all of it is metabolic syndrome. Metabolic syndrome. It starts, you're 20 years old, you're on the university track team, you're a woman, you've got a nice 28-inch waist, and you go to a drive-in restaurant and you order French fries and Coke. So starch and sugar really high. Up goes your blood sugar, your body makes insulin, that sugar just comes right down real quick. You got muscles and lots of places to store it. But as time goes by and you're on this type of diet, you get less and less places to store that energy. The tissues start rejecting insulin, and insulin has to work harder and harder and harder. So what I want to see on this slide is that yellow line. That's how much insulin your body's making, and this is over decades. And what you see is in the first phase, the insulin goes up, but the blood sugar doesn't budge. And in fact, 20% of people who present now, this is another new study, 20% of people who present with something called idiopathic neuropathy. So that means we don't know why, but people are getting numbness in their feet. They're actually normal glycemic diabetics. The high insulin is actually causing the neuropathy because it's driving, the nerve cells don't become insulin sensitive, so the insulin's driving sugar into those nerve cells and damaging them. So high insulin in itself is damaging, not just high blood sugar. Then you get to the point you can't make enough insulin, the blood sugar creeps up, the doctor says, hey, you're pre-diabetic. And then, of course, as time goes by, the glucose level goes up as your body's ability to make insulin goes down, and that you become that full-blown type 2 diabetic. But the point of the slide is the process starts decades before your blood sugar even moves. Okay, vitamin D. We talked about vitamin D briefly. I'm just simply saying here, okay, in this slide, it's a study that they did in Spain, and it was 80-some people, and they were being admitted to hospital. So in admission to hospital, 2/3 of them got an intravenous dose of vitamin D, very high dose, equivalent to 100,000 international units. That's like taking 100 vitamin D pills. And they got other doses along the way, and the other people didn't, and their outcome they're looking at was ICU admissions. In the group that got the vitamin D, only 2% were admitted to ICU. In the group that didn't get the vitamin D, 50% were admitted to ICU.
Wow. Now, that being said, don't go and take 100 vitamin D pills. I just want to make sure people don't self-medicate that way.
It won't work, because if you take it orally, it would take your body a month to convert it to the right form. Far better is take your 4,000 a day, and in a month, you're going to have your 100,000 units in you. It's fat soluble, so it's stored. You take your 100,000 by doing your 4,000 a day for a month. Okay. Vitamin D is intimately linked to diabetes mellitus. So high insulin stimulates a hormone that degrades active vitamin D. So we know low vitamin D is a massive risk factor for COVID, but I'm saying vitamin D is a marker also for metabolic syndrome, low vitamin D. Interesting study. In the winter, the bar on the left is people who didn't get vitamin D and got colds. And the darker shade is the people who got vitamin D and got colds. You can see it's 10 times difference.
Wow, massive difference.
Okay. All right, so trying to move along here. So my 3-step health plan. So people come to see me. I got to be quick. I got to be succinct. And I got to give them something they can take home and works. Cut out the processed food, the trifecta. Processed sugar, processed grains, processed oil. So, I mean, it's canola, mazola, Crisco, margarine. Cold pressed fruit oils are fine. So olive oil, coconut oil, avocado, any healthy animal fat, bacon fat, duck fat, butter, all good. Eat whole food as much as you can. Food that does not have an ingredient list, does not have a nutrition label. There's no ingredient list on a carrot. If you're healthy, you can eat natural carbs. You can eat carbs, but they've got to be naturally sourced, like fruit. Avoid juices. If you're going to have grains, pre-digest. So upgrade your grain, don't downgrade. So fermentation of flour makes sourdough bread way healthier. Sprouted bread, soaked oats. Okay, avoid the sugar drinks. If you're diabetic, you probably should avoid those even. No one should eat processed oils. We talked about that. Cold pressed oils. Okay, we talked about that. Okay, exercise daily. Something. The best exercise to do is the exercise you will do. So if it's just going for a walk, do it. Take the stairs. Bonus points for going to the gym, but not everybody can do that or will do that. And let's not make this something you hate. If you hate doing it, don't do it. And then lastly, we talked about time restricted eating, which means don't eat after supper. What better way to reduce insulin than going all night and halfway through the morning without any food? Great way. If we know this works, if we take 2 identical twins, it's exactly the same diet, same food, same cook, but one eats at 10 o'clock, the other eats at 6 o'clock, the 10 o'clock person's going to gain weight.
Doc, people are going, and I know that this is the best way to eat, but it is hard to get into. We all have our own habits. Is there some sort of easy way that you can do this? I mean, I use some of the Make Good Food delivery packages or HelloFresh. Have you ever tried any of those out as a way of getting any of your patients easily into this kind of pre-cooked different way of eating? Because I find I go with the low carb package whenever I do order it, and it's always delicious. I mean, I'm just wondering if there's a way to make people feel like they're not being punished, because there's a reason why we have the spare tire around the middle. Is we like eating chips and dip, and we like eating hamburgers and fries. And so what's the easy transition to get into that?
Maximize satiety. Bring yourself to fullness. I do have a few people who've done that service. The doctor works in my office. They do it, and it's very healthy food. I definitely think you have healthy choices there. There's bad choices too, but some of those companies have some really good stuff. I totally agree with you. But to answer your question, what you need to do is get yourself full to the point you don't want to eat anymore with food that makes sense. Food that has a shut off, right? So I tell people, when you first start this, overeat. For breakfast, I want you to have a 3-egg mushroom cheese omelet with some sausages that aren't full of breadcrumbs, an avocado, and a few pieces of cheese. I want you to be so stuffed after breakfast you won't want to eat for hours and hours and hours. Same with supper, right? I want you to eat that salmon. I want you to have some hamburger soup, a great big salad, and put some healthy meat and cheese and olives and and use olive oil for your dressing. Get yourself so stuffed at the end of supper that you won't want to eat, and then get up to the fridge, cut up 3 slices of cheese and put butter on them and eat them. Forget about the calories, just be stuffed. And I've never, to this day, had to tell anybody when to stop doing that. It seems if you get to about 3 or 4 weeks of not eating those snacks, the cravings subside. But you screw up once and they're right back again.
Oh, it's the truth. I want you to just connect how important, because it almost seems like it's the same old recommendation, exercise and eat well. But there's something really important about keeping your insulin under control. And well, I know you've got I don't know if you want to put up the book cover for Eat Rich, Live Long, because I know what happens every time I talk to you is people ask for your number and they say, I need that doc. But really, you can do this yourself, is I guess the takeaway for me, is because it really is medicating yourself just by shopping for different things and cooking them differently. And you can do so much of the work on your own without a doctor.
Anyone can do this. There's lots of resources. The more addicted you are to sugar, the harder it is. I get that. Okay, and I know there's some people addicted to sugar. You can't do that alone. You need help. Here's the Eat Rich, Live Long. This other one's the PE diet. A lot of those slides were from there. This is a great book as well. And then dietdoctor.com is a great website, biggest low-carb website in the world. There's a free side and a paid side. For those of you who are really addicted and really struggling, you have to have help. You need a forum. You need a buddy to do it with. So if your spouse will do it, great. But you can get here and you get lots of help here to help you through. It's really hard when those foods hit your limbic system and fire up as much as cocaine. It's so hard for those people to get off these kinds of foods. I get that. But it is doable. And this last slide here.
And this is important because I think this brings it all home, because that may have sounded like a diversion. Why are you telling me about healthy eating and exercise? Because it's all interconnected, especially when I look at the slides you sent over. If we're talking about the people most at risk of having a bad reaction if they get COVID, it's because of all of the metabolic syndromes that you were talking about, which are based on the excessive insulin or the poor insulin reaction. And so if you can address that, then you're able to be self-protective across your whole immune system. So not just a COVID year, but any influenza and cold season. So tell us how you bring it all home here in this last slide.
Yeah. Well, yeah, there's 2 pandemics, and one pandemic's making the other one far worse. And what are we going to do with the next pandemic? So plan going forward with regards to COVID, I would say immediately return to the restrictions we had in November. If at least, I would even think of opening up more, but at least go back to there. Allow doctors to at least temporarily order vitamin D. At this point, your doctor cannot order vitamin D except in a very few specific conditions. Discontinue in children. I am seeing new diseases in children. I'm seeing acne in teenagers, 2 new kind of acne, 2 exact circles on the cheeks, exact. It's like somebody drew a line, and it's coming from the mask. And sinus troubles, ear troubles, anxiety, not sleeping. These kids don't, especially young kids, they don't spread the virus. We've got good data on that. Why are we making them wear a mask? I don't get it. I get it with mask wearing's fine. I'm good with mask wearing for the adults, not for the kids. The government should actively pursue obtaining adequate supply of ivermectin. That's obvious. From what we've talked about, until a vaccine is available for all those at risk, other prophylactic measures like ivermectin. Why aren't we giving ivermectin to those people at risk who can't get to the vaccine yet? Dr. Corey, one of the EVMS doctors, prescribed ivermectin many, many times. He said, I don't see a downside. And I think that this drug is so safe and so little in side effects, and we've got decent data. It's not perfect, but it's decent. Why aren't we using it? The thing about hydroxychloroquine, we thought it worked, but the data wasn't there. We've got the data here now. Okay, and the last thing, government should set up. This is one of Dr. Premier Kenny's panel. Set up a panel and make your Alberta-made food guidelines. That's the food guidelines in Canada and the United States. They're all made by people with agendas and with input from the food companies. They don't listen to the science and docs like me. My big doctors group, the Canadian Clinicians for Therapeutic Nutrition, we're several thousand strong. There's lots of docs who promote this kind of diet. They didn't even listen to us. We had a big presentation. It's like it didn't even happen. Let's have our own Alberta food guidelines. Those guidelines they really are important because they're going to guide what the seniors get at their nursing homes.
It's sort of interesting to hear you say all of that, because when you're talking about there being a parallel, sort of two different crises that we have, that's the other area of research that needs to be done. Is you say, well, why isn't there any huge outbreaks and death in Central Africa? Maybe it's they don't have this kind of metabolic condition underlying the base in their population the same way that we do. And that'd be pretty important for us to know that.
Well, we know that in Japan, the 90% of the seniors have adequate levels of vitamin D. We know that. We know in northern Italy, like Lombardy, Italy, 90% of the seniors don't have adequate vitamin D. So that, again, that could be one reason why Japan did better. They're definitely a healthier population. But yeah, we have two pandemics. We should be dealing with both of them. We're not. We're trying to deal with one.
So Derek, I think that's the last of the slides. So you can put us back up. And I don't know. I know that we got a request last time around not to have comments when with the presentation. But if you have some comments, Derek, that you want to share, by all means, go ahead and do that while we're just wrapping up in our last couple of minutes of comments here. I guess, Doc, maybe I should ask you a complicated question, and I accept if you can't answer it, but what is with doctors being clamped down on by the College of Physicians and Surgeons or regulatory bodies? We're in a few weeks' time are going to be talking to what we're calling the deplatform docs, and they're ones who had to be indemnified. I mean, there's a lawyer, John Carpe with the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedom. He's told doctors, you can speak out because I will proactively cover you if your college comes after you. What's going on in your profession? Because that's madness.
And that's a good question, a difficult question. I wish I had a good answer to. We've had no guidance on ivermectin. I will say that I am free to prescribe ivermectin. No one's given me guidance one way or another, and I feel that that's the case. The question is to. So the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Alberta, they have a difficult task because they're supposed to regulate doctors, but they're doctors who make it up. And they know their job, and they know if they don't do it properly, the government's going to come in and do it for us. And so they are interested in having a very disciplined, good profession. They're interested in having, they want doctors to be very professional and not stray. Having said that, why they came out with the guidance on hydroxychloroquine, I don't know. I don't have an answer on that. They didn't say we couldn't prescribe it because they couldn't. They couldn't do that because it's a legal medicine. It's licensed for use in Canada. We can prescribe it for anything we want. But they basically came out and said, don't, because, we're worried about the supply for the people who are on it for arthritis and such. But that's all they have to say. These guys can, if they get into your life, they can hurt you in all sorts of ways. So why they had that guidance, I don't know. I'm not sure all the reasoning, but that's the first time it's ever really happened. The College of Physicians in.
Oh, darn it! You know what? The doc is in a. I'm surprised that his internet connection held up as well as it did. He said he was going to have to ask his wife to make sure that she didn't watch a Netflix show while he was on. I think, you know what, 9 o'clock, she said, I'm watching that Netflix show.
I got my wife on Netflix and my kids on Disney.
That's the difference between rural and urban, I think. Well, I'm sorry I wasn't able to say a proper goodbye. Oh, Dr. John, sorry we cut you. I figured that your wife has got the Netflix all fired up. You told me that you wanted to make sure that we didn't have too much going on your feed. But one last word, and then we're going to wrap it up.
Okay. Every day in my office, I see people who have lost 30, 40, 50, 100 pounds. This is doable, and the reason it works, what I'm telling you it works, is because you don't have to go hungry. The reason traditional diets fail is because you can't go hungry the rest of your life. Eat less, move more. Doesn't work. It can't work. You have to come to satiety. If you come to satiety with healthy foods, your body's weight regulation mechanisms will start to work.
All right, Dr. John, it's so amazing talking with you. I'm glad you agreed to do this one last hurrah, as I was calling it. I'm going to miss being able to do this with you. You've been such a great guide for me over the last few years, and I sure appreciate that. Keep doing what you're doing, and I hope that those of you who have Dr. John as your doctor, and I know that I had a couple of listeners who did, you are very, very lucky. And those of you who don't have Dr. John as your doc, go look up Eat Rich, Live Long, and you'll be able to get the guide. So once again, Doc, thanks so much for being with us and being so generous with your time today.
Pleasure.
Yeah. And now I'll hand it back to Derek Fildebrand. Thanks again for hosting this for us, Derek.
Well, thank you very much for guest hosting. As I was telling you off the air before we started, our lucky sponsor today, Chiron's Way, paid Derek Fildebrand prices, and she got Danielle Smith delivery. So we're very glad to have you guest hosting today. And Dr. John, very grateful to you for joining us, sharing your expertise with us. I really enjoy this long form kind of interview. As I kind of put it when we did the show last week, the first one, it's kind of like Joe Rogan without acid. Not that I'm not blaming, actually. I blame mainstream media for a lot of things, but I don't really blame them for the short form interview where you're just trying to get through. People have short attention spans. There's a lot of options for people to consume media from. So it's a bit of a risk doing long form journalism like this. And I was pretty skeptical that it would work, and I was proven completely wrong last time. I continue to be proven wrong today. I'm going to stop coming up with my own ideas and just trust people around me who know what they're doing now. So I'm very grateful to you both for joining us today. I think it's a huge success. I must also thank all of our guests who joined us. Great interactions. I saw quite spirited debate in the comment sections. I had one person asking me, Derek, there's a Karen in there and she's really pissing me off. You should get rid of her. I said, no, I hate Karen too, but she gets everybody commenting. So let's just let Karen go. She's more fun to debate than to silence. So
Derek, I'd love for people to know what episode 3 is. We may as well use this opportunity to tell people who we're seeing on Thursday.
Yeah. Oversight on my part. We have a really special episode 3 coming up. Everybody's probably aware by now of Pastor James Coates of the Grace Life Church in Stony Plain, Alberta, just west of Edmonton. He has been thrown in jail and denied bail because he refused to stop preaching. His appeal on that bail is coming right up on Thursday, I think it is, if I'm not mistaken. And that very same day, Dr. John, I guess Mrs. John is watching Netflix. So on the very same day, we've got Pastor John's wife, Pastor Coates' wife, Erin Coates. She's going to be on. Danielle's going to be guest hosting her. What it's been like. Why is Pastor Coates taking the stand he is? Why is he refusing to back down? A lot of people just don't understand, especially people who aren't regular churchgoers. I'm a pretty poor churchgoer. I think last time I was in church, it was when my daughter was getting baptized. But I think I have a pretty good understanding of why he is doing what he's doing, but a lot of people don't. So we want to hear, we wanted to get Pastor Coates, but he is in prison right now, and the Wi-Fi connection is not very good as far as I know. So we're doing the next best thing. We're having Pastor Coates' wife, Erin Coates, on with her lawyer, John Carpe from the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. We're going to do another 2-hour program next Thursday, 7 p.m. Mountain Standard Time.
This Thursday, March the 4th.
This Thursday, yeah. We are, in general, we're lucky to have Danielle twice a week, Tuesdays and Thursdays at 7 p.m., with the exception of next week. But we're going to have Danielle back after that. We're going to continue our series on uncensored COVID topics. We have some great other ones coming up that we'll announce very soon. But the next real big one coming up is this Thursday, 7 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. We're going to have a real treat talking to the jailed pastor's wife and her lawyer.
All right. Thanks, Derek.
Thank you. And before we go, I'm obliged to mention covidcommonground.ca. They are, I won't call sponsors, but they have been, some of the people behind it have been a big part of bringing this series of uncensored COVID topics together with you and the Western Standard. So shout out to covidcommonground.ca. They promised their website would be working by right now, so hopefully it is. You guys can check it out, find some more information. Thank you all very much. We appreciate your attendance. God bless.